needs to be held because it's critical to solving this problem, which we've seen in too many places. But there are some of these issues which can be handled more quickly, and I think the way to do that is if the Senate passes it without concealed carry, they can do a conference and get something fairly quickly.
Yeah, it actually could probably get done in a week. Mark, take a listen to Senator Pat Toomey yesterday on a Sunday show.
Sure.
I've spent a lot of hours on the phone and communicating in other ways with my colleagues this week. I do think there are some members who were not supportive in the past who are reconsidering. I haven't got anyone who said, yes, sign me up, Pat, but there are definitely members who are reconsidering. The president's expression of support for strengthening our background check system is very constructive. The president can play a huge and, in fact, probably decisive role in this. So I intend to give this another shot.
Mark, despite some bipartisan support for that bill, it did go down in 2013. I know that you take a look at a lot of public opinion polls, and do you think that there has been a significant amount of change that could actually change the outcome if they bring this bill back up for a vote?
Well, I don't think there's really been a change in public opinion. About 61% actually support an AR-15 ban, and they have for a long time. I think that public opinion has said, hey, we want more gun safety legislation. Congress has said, hey, we know what's happened in the past when we've done that, which is we've gotten voted out. And so somewhere in between now, I think that there's a dynamic for action. I think the dynamic for action has to be some gun safety, some school security, and some mental health. That if it's a balanced package, and I think it's really quite fascinating here that Trump has almost a Nixon goes to China moment where he's going into the NRA and saying, hey, I'm going to get you to do some things you probably weren't going to do when you gave me my support, and you're going to come out better for it.
Right, and he's having a meeting with them, laying the groundwork for possibly getting them to either make a change in their opposition or at least to delay it until they can try to get something moving. Take a listen, David, if you will, to Brian Sandoval. He's the governor of Nevada, and he touched on what you were saying, is that there are some pretty complex issues here. Listen.
You were looking for some suggestions, some ideas, and it'll come in the form of questions as well, but I would suggest, Mr. President, with regard to the scope of the FBI background checks, if we could broaden those, Mr. President, because I know in my state, our background checks are much broader. Something else that we have done in Nevada with regard to school safety is I included in my budget more money for social workers in the schools.
You almost never get out of the governor's meeting without requests for more federal government resources. David, do you think that is a possibility here if we are going to meet the goal of improving school safety?
I think that there's going to have to be a combination of federal and state resources if you're going to harden the schools, which they're talking about and everybody seems to believe is necessary. You may have to extend the perimeter and harden the schools as well. This is going to cost some money, putting more officers in the schools so that people can't ever get in the school with a gun. That's got to be the primary goal right now. That's not going to be able to be done simply with federal money. States are going to have to participate in this. They're going to have to look at their budgets very hard and find some money for this as well.
Mark, last question to you, which is the president is making a move here, saying that sometimes you have to fight the NRA. Do you think that there will be leadership on the Democratic side that will help him try to get this done, even if it means not getting everything that they want?
Well, that's the big question. Will this go down exactly like immigration? Some people want only gun. Some people want no gun safety in it. Will they compromise? I tend to think on this one, it's easier for everyone to compromise. After all, no Democrat would be against 100,000 cops in schools. And I think Trump should look at how the 100,000 cop program was implemented and look at 100,000 school guns. How could a Democrat oppose that as long as they get enough gun safety legislation in here? And he's negotiated that with the NRA. He has a big opportunity for a win or just more gridlock.
All right, David Hoppe and Mark Penn, I always appreciate your thoughts. Thank you.
Happy.
Deadly storms hitting parts of the Midwest, and the worst may not be over, with even more rain in the forecast for places that are already underwater. Plus, Democrats divided on who to put up in November. Will the party go for Rivers before new storms and more rain hit the region tomorrow? The storms resulted in more than a dozen tornadoes. The flooding and high winds are blamed for at least 5 deaths in 3 states. With primary season almost upon us, Democrats are hoping to regain control of Congress. But Josh Kroshar, writing in the National Journal, says Democratic primary voters aren't looking for electability. Most want to be part of the resistance. If enthusiasm alone is enough to generate a sizable Democratic wave, it may not matter how qualified their congressional candidates are. But if there are enough suburban independent voters up for grabs, Democrats could squander winnable seats by nominating some not ready for primetime players. Let's bring in Fox News politics editor Chris Stirewalt. The disarray that the Democrats are going through, it's sort of been bubbling underneath the surface, but it's about to come to a head here, especially as they see some primaries in March.
Absolutely. Republicans out there can have some sympathy for Democrats who find themselves in very much the same place that Republicans were in the first midterm of Barack Obama's presidency. Huge energy in the base, giant churning energy in the base. But that's not always in keeping with what's best for which district. So the test for Democrats now, with the resistance as it was for the Tea Party for Republicans 8 years ago, it's this. Can you match candidates for districts? In some districts in California, you know, the big story about Dianne Feinstein not winning the Democratic Party's nomination, that's a big deal, except for, remember this, in California it probably doesn't matter. You could probably elect Mr. Green Jeans as a Democrat in California this year, just given how bad off the Republicans are in that state. But as Josh points out, in other districts and other places where this election for control of the House will be won or lost, it won't be suitable to have a resist kind of candidate, and they'll need somebody like they have in Connor Lamb, who's running in a special election up in Pennsylvania right now, somebody who is moderate and somebody who can talk to moderate voters. Yeah,
there's actually, Mitch McConnell had to try to lead a course correction actually for Republicans to make that better for the Republicans' future. Listen to this. I mean, it's a little early to talk about 2020, but it doesn't mean that Democrats aren't thinking about it. Terry McAuliffe apparently told the Washington Free Beacon that who better to take on Trump than me? So he's already thinking about it. And when you think about the Democrats having this pull between pragmatists and progressives, he would be much more in the pragmatist camp.
He has one big problem. He is solidly identified with the Clintons, who are just a dire political brand now. Bill and Hillary Clinton have gone from being very popular national political figures to just the worst, just the pits. So McAuliffe does have that, but he also has a Trumpian gift for boast. So I'm not surprised that he is out there saying, "Oh yeah, well I'll do." He said, you know, if he comes after me, I'll lay him out. So he wants to be the pugilist who can fight back against Trump. Whether he can survive a 24-way, 25-way Democratic primary. Who knows?
Who knows? That will be fun to watch, though.
Oh, my gosh, yes.
I want to ask you about Senator Bob Corker. This is a quote from Congresswoman Blackburn. She has, of course, thrown her hat in the ring for that Senate seat. And on Saturday at the Tennessee Republican dinner, she said, "I know that the U.S. Senate is a source of frustration. It's broken. You cannot send people to the Senate who have broken it to try to fix it." So they're in a little bit of a fix there in Tennessee because Bob Corker says nothing has changed as of now, but is he really thinking about not retiring?
I don't think he can win. I don't know I don't know the thought, but I think at this point, and that's why, and Blackburn has come out very hard against him, because if he got in the race, it would put her in a real pickle. You have to still consider her the front runner, but there's a former Congressman, Stephen Fincher, who's trying to get to the right of her, which is saying something with Marsha Blackburn, but that would leave her caught between the well-known current senator and this outsider. It would be a tough spot. So she needs to get one of her flanks covered if she wants to get through into what is going to be a competitive general election with a popular former Democratic governor getting ready to run.
I think it was Trent Franks out of Arizona who said that if somebody could get to his right, that he'd vote for him too.
No, he said, God help him.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Chris Stirewalt, thank you.
You bet.
Hundreds of civilians killed this past week in Syria, and growing concerns the government may be using chemical weapons were live in the region. He's a decorated veteran and former Navy SEAL who to word that several people near Damascus suffered symptoms consistent with chlorine gas exposure. Connor Powell is live in our Mideast Bureau in Jerusalem. Connor.
Dana, on Saturday, the UN Security Council passed a resolution demanding a ceasefire, a 30-day ceasefire in Syria because of the violence in East Ghouta. But what we're seeing there today is very similar to what we saw there before the UN passed that resolution for the ceasefire. It is heavy bombing by Syrian and Russian jets of that rebel-held enclave. And now there are reports that the Assad regime may have once again used some type of chemical weapon, most likely chlorine gas, as they've used so many times before, reportedly in Syria. At least 18 people were treated for symptoms that were similar to a gas attack, and then one child is reportedly to have died as well. Now, this 30-day ceasefire has been talked about for some time now, but the ability to actually implement it on the ground, and particularly in this rebel-held area outside of Damascus, has so far proved impossible. The Assad regime and the Russians together have just been killing dozens, hundreds of people in the last few weeks as well. 500 is the last number that the international monitors that are on the ground there say have been killed just in about the last 10 days or so. The situation there is a humanitarian crisis, according to all groups. They say there's a shortage of medical supplies, of food, of water. The Assad regime has been accused of targeting hospitals and civilian blocks. Now, the real key to getting a ceasefire approved and to actually get it implemented is Russia. The Putin regime, or the Putin government in Moscow, is saying so far that they will not approve any type of ceasefire, a 30-day one, unless the rebels and the other terrorists, as they call it, also do it. But the Putin-backed coalition is also saying they will do a 5-hour temporary ceasefire tomorrow. We'll wait to see if that actually is implemented. Dana.
Right. Connor, thank you. More on this now with Brian McKeon. He's former Deputy Assistant to President Obama and former Acting Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Based on your expertise, sir, what good is a ceasefire if the government then is bombing civilians? And is there anything that can be done sort of immediately beyond this 5 hours that the Russians say they'll allow?
Well, the ceasefire obviously is not worth anything at the moment as long as the Syrians are not complying and the Russians are not using any of their leverage over Bashar al-Assad to get the ceasefire working. So for the moment, it's just an empty gesture by the Security Council, and it's going to take pressure from Syria's patron in Moscow to make something happen. Take
a listen to Ambassador Frederick Hoff. He was the former envoy to Syria. He was on TV last night.
I suspect there are people in eastern Ghouta right now who are saying, please, Mr. Assad, attack us with sarin, because if you do, perhaps the world will come to our assistance. He concluded with respect to President Obama, if I don't use sarin gas, I can use anything I want. I'm afraid that Assad is testing this president's chemical red line.
In addition to that, Ziad Alisa, he's a union of medical care and relief organizations. He said this to the New York Times: I am ashamed of the UN Security Council. The most powerful nations in the world are unable to enforce the most basic standards of human rights. Failure to enforce these resolutions calls into question the very reason for this process. They are disconnected from reality. You pointed out that Secretary Tillerson had outlined the administration's goals here. What is the next step then if we are to ratchet it up, if we do it all?
Yeah, the Secretary gave a pretty good policy speech 5 weeks ago, but the administration needs to back that up with a lot more muscle, both diplomatic muscle and funding on the ground for stabilization in the areas that were liberated by ISIS. But the crisis right now in eastern Ghouta is unspeakable carnage against the civilian population. The Russians and the Syrians, they don't distinguish between the civilians, the moderate opposition, and the terrorist groups. They're going to bomb any targets they see as legitimate. They ran this play in Aleppo 15 to 18 months ago. And absent pressure on Russia and pressure on Syria from Washington and the other major powers in the world, this carnage is unfortunately going to continue.
Do you have an opinion on whether the president has all the authority that he needs, either under the Constitution or under the 2001 authorization to use military force, if he were to decide to take action? Or do you think Congress needs to act to provide him more leeway?
I think it'd be useful for the Congress to step forward and provide a new authorization for the use of military force generally, both with regard to some of the ISIS branches around the world. We're a long way from 2001 and the authorization after the 9/11 attack, so I think it would be useful for Congress to step in. And the authority vis-a-vis the Syrian regime is not at all clear. The president invoked his Article 2 powers when he used Tomahawk missiles last April after a Syrian chemical attack.
Right. Well, we'll see what happens. Brian McKeon, thank you.
Thank you.
So the Supreme Court sparring today over a case involving organized labor that could affect some 5 million workers. We'll explain. Plus, a Republican running for Congress who is ready to go the distance, literally running 100 miles in Texas. Dan.
Back. And part of that is the issues that Texans care about. That's going to be border security, immigration reform, and also national security issues. And I'm the only candidate in the race who really understands what our country is facing abroad. My last deployment was to Korea. My deployment before that was working in the Arabian Gulf against the Iranians. I really know how to keep this country safe. I've got the classified briefings. I've got the right experience. I've got a master's in policy from Harvard. And I think Texans deserve the best to represent them up in Congress.
So how does this work on March 6th? As I understand it, the top two vote getters, if no one gets 50%, then it goes to a runoff?
That is correct.
And you have somebody who is actually a strong self-funder in the Democratic on the Republican side, someone who's able to put $3 million into their campaign. Are you worried that you are not be able to match resources?
Well, I definitely can't match resources, and in fact, it's double that. It's almost $6 million now. It's actually the most in U.S. history for a congressional race, the most self-funding in U.S. history. So it's but I'm no stranger to challenges. I love challenges, and you know the word is getting out. Everybody I talk to is supportive or excited. My campaign is not about money or political connections. It's about heart. It's about service to the American people. It's about message. It's about getting in front of voters and delivering our message and giving them hope for a better future, giving them hope that the Republican Party has a future. And we should be really concerned about. Democrats are coming out in full force this election cycle.
My last question to you would be, any advice for someone who really can't even run errands? I'm amazed that you ran that many miles over 5 days.
Train for it. You know, I didn't have a lot of time to train for it, and my knees are paying the price right now, I'll tell you that.
All right, Dan Crenshaw, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Dana.
The Supreme Court hearing arguments in a case that could deal a financial blow to labor unions. The justice is considering a challenge to public sector unions' ability to collect fees from unwilling employees. Jillian Turner is live in Washington. Jillian, what are the implications of this case for the labor movement?
Well, Dana, huge stakes in this case for government labor unions, American workers, and the midterms later in the year. In 22 states, government employees can be forced to pay a portion of their salary to a union, whether they want to or not. And with those payments, they're also funding what their opponents say is the union's political candidates.
100% of what a government union does is political by nature. Even President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a strong advocate for collective bargaining rights, strong advocate for unions, he was uncomfortable. He was against the power of government unions.
American labor unions make political donations to Democrats totaling around $100 million every election cycle. But advocates like Illinois' Attorney General insist they're not inherently political and that when government unions are weak, American workers will suffer.
You will see a steep and fast decline in our middle class, greater economic inequality in our country.
The court did revisit this issue 2 years ago in the wake of Justice Scalia's passing, but deadlocked on the issue. Now with Trump appointing Neil Gorsuch on the bench, he's widely expected to cast a deciding vote against the unions. But no word on his position out of today's hearing as he remains silent. Dana?
That's a big case, but there's another one. The Supreme Court made a decision on Dreamers today. What was that?
Yeah, so the court has now turned down President Trump's request for a hearing on the issue and effectively blocked his plan to shut down DACA, an ongoing program created by President Obama to protect 700,000 young immigrants from deportation. Top House Democrat Nancy Pelosi today called President Trump's plans unjust, cruel, and legally questionable, and said the fate of Dreamers is ultimately in the hands of Congress. Meanwhile, the White House press office now punching back, saying they're confident President Trump's plan will ultimately prevail. Today's Supreme Court decision leaves President Trump and Dreamers in a state of limbo. This issue now likely to remain open for several more months unless Democrats and Republicans can strike a deal. Dana?
And unlikely in the midterm. All right, thank you so much, Jillian Turner. A young survivor of the Parkland shooting thanks the men and women who saved her life.
I'm so grateful to be here, and it wouldn't be possible without those officers and first responders and these amazing doctors, and especially all the love that everyone has sent.
More on the students who were wounded in Florida. Plus, we are one step closer to a military parade in Washington. There's more to know, and Brian Kilmeade will fill us in.
I'd like to have a parade. A lot of the generals would like to have a parade to celebrate what we're doing. You know, our military was very depleted. It was going in the wrong direction. And I want to have, by far, the most powerful military in the world.
Plus,